Hello, and welcome to Stories for the Family. I am Shannon Thompson. I'm the Story Center Program Manager, and I am here to welcome you today. Today, we have Laura Packer to tell stories. Laura Packer has been telling stories her whole life. The daughter of a children's librarian and a writer, it seems inevitable that she became a storyteller and a writer herself. Her deep love of fairy tales and mythology eventually led her to obtain a degree in folklore and mythology from Boston University, and Laura has since built a career helping people and organizations find their own story, performing original and traditional tales all around the world. All right, take it away, Laura.
Shannon, thank you so very much. I am so happy to be here today. I hope wherever all of you are, it is a lovely day and that you are safe and sound and ready for some great stories. I'm really excited about this. The first story I want to share with you is from England, or maybe Ireland, I'm not sure which, and it is called The Stars in the Sky. Once upon a time, there was a girl who loved the stars more than anything else in the world. During the day, she would do her chores and her work, but all through the day, she was just waiting until the world grew dim and then dark, and she could look up and see the stars twinkling down upon her. She loved them so much that soon it grew within her a desire, a need to actually go up and be amongst the stars themselves, but she didn't know how. At first, she tried climbing the tree outside of her home, but when she was at the top of the tree, she was no closer to the stars than she had been before. The next night, she put a ladder against her house and climbed up the ladder. And when she was on the very tip top of her house, well, she was just as far away as she had been when she was on the tree, which was just as far away as she had been when she was on the ground. And so she set out to see if she could find some way to be amongst the stars. She finished her chores for the day and then set out walking. She walked and walked and walked, looking at the stars the whole time for guidance. But after a time, she grew tired and curled herself up next to an old mill and fell asleep. In the morning, she woke up and stretched, and the mill looked at her and said, "Well, hello there." Now, you might think it's strange that a building was talking, but once upon a time, even buildings could talk. She looked back at the mill and said hello in exchange, and they talked back and forth. And finally, the mill said to her, "I noticed you come and sleep beside me last night. What brings you to my side?" And the girl responded, "Well, I have always loved the stars, and now I am on a quest to see if I can find a way to actually be amongst them." And the mill sighed in response, "Oh, you stay here until night, and the pond by my side, well, the stars are in that pond every night. They are so bright that I can scarcely sleep." And so she stayed by the mill for the day. She spent the day looking at the birds and the plants, reading the book she had brought with her, and just waiting until the sun set and she could see the stars in the mill pond. Well, soon it was dark, and the pond was very still, and indeed, there were the stars. She looked down into the stars and saw her own face among them reflected back in the pool. And so she stepped into the water, thinking now she would be amongst the stars. But as soon as she stepped into the water, the ripples spread, and as the ripples spread, the stars seemed to vanish. She pulled herself up out of the pond, dried herself off, and kept walking. And she walked and walked and walked, watching the stars the whole time until finally she was so tired she had to sleep. She curled up next to a stream and fell into a deep and easy rest. In the morning, when she woke up, she stretched all the sleep out of her body when the stream said hello. And she wasn't surprised because in those days, streams too could talk. She greeted the stream, and the stream asked, "What brings you to my banks? I saw you sleeping there the night through. Why are you here? We've not met before." And the girl told the stream all about her deep need to be amongst the stars. And the stream said, "Well, that's easy. If you just wait till night, the streams are in the still parts of my, the stars are in the still part of my stream amongst the reeds and the rocks. And so she waited by the stream. She spent the day splashing her feet back and forth in the water, looking up at the shapes of the trees against the sky, and reading her book. And gradually night fell. Once the world was dark, she looked down at the stream amongst the reeds and the rocks, and there she could see the stars. She stepped into the water, but as soon as she did, her reflection chased the ripples, chased the stars away, and then she stepped on a sharp pebble and had to pull her foot out quickly, and so she knew the stars were not to be found here either. So she dried off, and she walked. She walked and she walked until she came to a great mound, and on that mound there were fairies dancing the night away. She watched them dance and whirl, and she watched the stars, and both were so beautiful, but she couldn't help herself. And she sighed out her sorrow that she was not amongst the stars themselves. The fairies, the little people, they heard her and came over to see what was distressing her. And she said, "I am so hungry to be up amongst the stars, but I did not find them in the mill pond, and I did not find them in the stream, and I do not see them here." The fairies looked at one another and said, "But don't you know that the stars are in the grass itself that we dance upon? Come dance with us." And so she did. She danced with them all night long, and while she could see the stars caught in the grass that they danced upon, she didn't feel as if she were amongst them. And so when it was close to time for dawn to break, she sighed again, and the fairies asked what was wrong. "And the stars here are lovely, but it's not the same as the stars in the sky." So one of the fairies walked up to her and said, "Here is what you must do. You must find 4 feet. Have 4 feet take you to no feet, and have no feet take you to the stairs without steps, and then," said the girl, "and then I will be amongst the stars." "And then," replied the fairy, "you will be somewhere you've not been before." And the fairies were gone. The girl looked around, and she saw, tethered to a tree, a horse. She walked up to the horse and said, "Excuse me, but can you take me to no feet?" The horse looked at her and replied, "I only do what the fairies have told me to do." "Well, the fairies told me that 4 feet would take me to no feet, who would take me to the stairs without steps, and then I would find the stars." "Very well," said the horse, "hop on my back." So she hopped on the back of the horse, and the horse walked and wandered, weaved its way along through the world until finally it came to the edge of a great lake. "This is as far as I can go," said the horse. "You must hop down." And so she did. And she thanked the horse, who then went wandering back to his own story, which is neither here nor there. She looked out at the edge of the lake and at the water stretching far beyond, and at the very edge of the world, she could faintly see the colors of a rainbow. Oh, it is so beautiful, but it is not the stars. She heard a splashing in front of her, looked down, and there was an enormous fish. "What are you doing at the edges of my lake, sighing and moaning?" asked the fish. "Oh," she replied, "you must be No Feet. Will you take me out to the stairs that have no steps?" "I only do what the fairies command," replied the fish. "Well, the fairies told me that 4 feet would take me to no feet, and no feet would take me to the stairs without steps, so please, will you help me?" "Very well," replied the fish. "Climb on." She made her way onto the fish's back, which was slippery and smooth, and did her best to hold on as the fish began to swim through the lake until they came to the edge of the rainbow. The fish shook itself, and the girl splashed down into the water. "Here you go," said the fish. "My job here is done." And he dove down deep, deep, deep into the lake, though that is, of course, another story. She looked up at the rainbow. She reached up one hand and managed to get a grip, and then reached up with another and pulled herself up. And again, she pulled herself up. It was such hard work, And the rainbow was so slick and slippery, but finally she found herself there at the very top of the rainbow, just as the sun was beginning to set. She could see off to the west the stars starting to appear in the sky, and she knew that she would be closer than she ever had been before when the light went out of the world and the rainbow vanished. Down, down, down she fell, until all of a sudden she hit something hard and woke up to find herself there on her bedroom floor, right next to her bed. She sat up and was tangled amongst the blankets and the bedclothes, and she never did find the stars. But from that day to this, people would look at her and say, "Oh, that girl, she has the stars in her eyes." That story is from More English Folktales by Joseph Jacobs. You can find it at MCPL when they open. So I'm sure that book is available to you, and there are many wonderful other stories in there. The next story I'd like to tell you is from Japan. And I wanted to share this story with you in particular because I was thinking about how we are all frightened right now. Some of us are frightened, and that the best thing we can do is do the things that we are best at. And Shannon, this story is also for you and for your cat. A long time ago in Japan, there was a farmer who had many children. He loved them all, and almost all of them were just as good at working with their hands and working the land as he was himself. All of them except for his youngest son. His youngest son was smart, there was no doubt about that, and he was kind as all of the farmer's children were, but he was not a farmer. He would do his best to plant and to dig and to tend the things that they grew, but really all he wanted to do was draw. He would draw from morning to night, and his favorite thing of all to draw were cats. He drew big cats and small cats, fat cats and skinny cats, cats of solid colors, cats with stripes, cats with long straight whiskers, and cats with whiskers that curled. He loved drawing cats, and his father watched him draw cats and saw how he wasn't a very good farmer, and one day said to his son, "My boy, I love you as much as the rest of my children, and I see no reason for you to stay here and be miserable as you try to be a farmer. So instead, you must go to the monastery. Perhaps you can learn to be a monk." And so the boy was taken to the monastery. He hugged his father goodbye, and he stayed there, and he did the best he could to be a good monk. He swept, and he cooked, and he meditated, and he prayed, but most of all, he drew. He drew from morning to night, and more than anything else, he drew cats. He drew big cats and small cats, fat cats and thin cats, cats of solid colors, cats with stripes, cats with long straight whiskers, and cats with whiskers that curled. His cats were beautiful, but drawing cats is not being a monk. And so finally, one day, the head of the monastery came to him and said, "My boy, I know you have done your best, but you will be no happier here than you would have been as a farmer. And so I beg you, go back home and see what other path there may be for you." And so the boy, sad, gathered up his paints and his brushes and turned to walk home. Just as he left the monastery door, the monk called out after him, "I have one piece of advice for you. Stay away from large spaces at night. Stick to the small." The boy thanked him and shrugged, not knowing what use this advice was, and set out to walk home. As he walked, he looked at the world around him and thought about how he might draw it. He thought about how the trees were tall and straight, but their twigs looked kind of like cat's whiskers. He watched the way the grasses moved in the breeze and thought they twitched like cats' tails. And he heard the hum of the wind in the world and thought it was almost like the sound of a cat's purr. And as he walked home, he watched the sun make its way across the sky until it was just about to set, and he knew he needed to find someplace safe to stay. On a hill not too far from him, he saw an old building, what looked like an old monastery. So he made his way up the trail and thought, "I know how to stay in a monastery. I know what to do. Perhaps they will let me stay the night. The light growing dim around him meant that he could not see the sign that said, "Beware, the demon Rat King lives here." He walked up to the monastery and knocked on the door, and the door creaked open underneath his knock. He stepped inside and saw that it was empty, not a single soul to be seen, and so he thought, well, at least I can sleep here and stay safe. There was just enough light that he thought perhaps he would draw for a little while before he went to bed. So he pulled out his brushes and paints and began to paint cats all over the walls, big cats and small cats, fat cats and thin cats, cats with solid colors and cats with stripes, cats with long straight whiskers and cats with whiskers that curled. And when finally all the light had fallen out of the room, he knew it was time to go to sleep. And he remembered the monk's advice. Do not stay in large places at night. Stick to the small. He looked around until he found a little cabinet, opened up the door, and crawled in and pulled the door shut after himself, and he went to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, he heard a terrible noise, screeching and wailing, clawing and bashing. It was so loud and so frightening that he just hugged himself closer. It was, you could say, a caterwauling of a noise. He lay there until the noise finally died down and stayed awake for a long time afterwards. He finally fell back asleep, just as the light was beginning to creep into the room. He woke up some time later to see creaks of light all over his little cabinet, so he pushed open the door and stepped outside. And the room was full of carcasses of rats, rat heads and rat tails, rat fur drifting in the air. And then he looked at the pictures of his cats, and there they all were, looking as self-satisfied as only a cat can. And when he looked closer, he realized that some of the cats had a smudge of blood on their face or a little bit of fur tucked under their claws. He looked at them for a long time, then bowed low to thank them for keeping him safe all night long. When he left the monastery, he did not go home, but instead walked until he came to the city. And as time passed, he soon became known as a great artist, and one in particular as a great artist who drew cats. The Boy Who Drew Cats. Thank you. That's an old Japanese story. There are versions of it all over the place, and many, many storytellers share that story. It's one of my favorites, and I think it's a really fun one to tell. So I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you have a cat, maybe you should tell that to your cat sometime, and who knows, well, they might respond. The next story that I want to share with you is another one of those tales that has many, many different versions. It's one that I learned from my family, and I've heard other storytellers tell it, so every single one of these versions is, of course, correct. It is called Just Enough. There was once a young man named Joseph. Joseph lived with his father, and his father was a great tailor. Now, Joseph, more than anything else, wanted to grow up and be as good a tailor as his father, so he worked with him as an apprentice. And one day, his father sent him to market to buy fabric for the next round of clothing that they were to sew. He wandered around the market looking at all of the different cloth, the red cloth and the blue, the thick cloth and the thin, the silks and satins and cottons and wools. It was a feast for the eyes. And then Joseph saw a fabric that took his breath away. It was thick and warm. It was a dark gray with threads of different colors running through it. It was all his favorite colors, which I bet are probably your favorite colors too, so you know exactly what that fabric looked like. And he could not help himself. He bought several yards of that fabric along with all of the others he had to fetch, made his way back home to his father, and then showed it to his dad. His father agreed that it was beautiful fabric and then said, "Well, Joseph, what do you want to do with this fabric?" And Joseph replied, "Father, I think this fabric would make me a wonderful coat. It is so cold in the winters here, a coat with a collar that stands up and a long coat that comes down all the way to my knees, so I am nice and warm. Father, would you make me a coat of this fabric?" His father looked at him and replied, "Joseph, my son, I believe that you can make that coat for yourself." And so Joseph measured and cut and sewed, and soon he had a wonderful coat that was warm and fit him perfectly, and he loved the fabric. His father was so proud of him that from that day forward, Joseph was no longer an apprentice, but he and his father worked side by side. A few years later, Joseph was in the market purchasing fabric for more, excuse me for a moment. Thank you. For more clothing, for more cloth that he would make into clothing with his father. And the skies opened up. Rain was pouring from the sky and everyone was dashing for cover. Now he had his nice warm coat on, so it wasn't so bad. He stepped to the side and there he saw a young woman not wearing a coat at all, soaked through to the skin and clearly so cold. So he took off his coat and set it around her shoulders as they stood there and waited for the rain to end. Well, you know what happens. Not much more than a year later, the two were married and they were so happy together. And they were happy together for a year or two. And one day Joseph was sitting at their kitchen table and he sighed with such sorrow. His wife looked at him and said, "Joseph, why are you sad?" "My coat," he said. "My coat, the one that brought us together. My coat, the one that my father was so proud of me for making. My coat is worn through, and it is time to let it go." "Joseph," she said, "look at this coat." And she measured, and she snipped, and she sewed, and soon she gave him a beautiful jacket made from the same fabric. He put the jacket on and wore it with such pride and delight, and he wore that jacket for a long time, for years. Well, not too long later, his wife gave birth to two beautiful babies, twins, a boy and a girl. And when those babies were toddlers, he brought them out to the woods, to the world at night, and showed them the night sky. He held one on one side and the other on the other, and they together looked up at the stars and the meteors. And time passed. And one day, Joseph was sitting at the table, and he sighed, so sad. And his daughter, now a young woman, looked at him and said, "Father, why are you sighing? What's wrong?" He replied, "Well, my darling, my jacket, the jacket I love, the jacket that I wore when I held you and your brother and we looked up at the meteors in the sky, the jacket that had been the coat that brought me and your mother together, the coat that had been the fabric that made my father so proud of me, my jacket is wearing out." "Father," said his daughter, "surely there is just enough." And so he measured, and he snipped, and he sewed, and he made himself a lovely little cap. And he wore that cap with such delight. He wore it everywhere he went. People knew him by his cap, and time passed. And now his daughter had married and given birth to a son of her own, but hard times had fallen upon the village, and everyone was so hungry. So Joseph and his wife, his daughter and her husband, and their toddler son went out walking to see if they could find anything to eat, to just get some relief from the heartache inside of them. And they came to a bush full of berries. They began to eat the berries. They were so sweet in their mouths. And then Joseph took off his cap and they filled it with berries and took it home. And time passed. And now Joseph was sitting at his table, sighing and bemoaning his fate. His daughter and his son and all of the grandchildren were there, and they said, "Grandfather, what's wrong?" And he said, "Well, my cap, the cap that I filled with berries so the oldest of you could taste sweetness for the first time, the cap that had been my jacket that I wore when I took your parents out and let them see meteors, the jacket that had been the coat that brought me and your grandmother together, the coat that had been the fabric that made my father so proud. My cap is wearing out, and soon it will be done. And his grandson looked at him and said, Grandfather, surely there's just enough. So Joseph measured and snipped and sewed, and soon he had a handsome bow tie that he wore everywhere. He wore it to market, he wore it to visit with friends, he wore it when he sewed, he wore it all the time. And time passed. And now his eldest granddaughter was getting ready to give birth to his first great-grandchild, and he walked to visit her, and there she was with her round belly, and he sat down next to her, and he sighed. Grandfather, she said, what is wrong? He said, my bow tie, it's gone. I must have lost it somewhere. And she said, Grandfather, I remember how, when I was a child, you took that bow tie and pretended it was a butterfly. And even if that bow tie is gone, surely for my child, your great-grandchild, you can tell the child that story of the butterfly that had been the bow tie, that had been the cap, that had been the jacket, that had been the coat, that had been the cloth. And that is exactly what Joseph did. Thank you. So that story, the version I know, is called Just Enough, and I'm sure you've heard other versions from storytellers. Sorry, I disappeared for a moment. I apologize. I'm glad to be back. Shannon, I hope you can see me. I hope everybody can see me. So I have one last story that I'd like to share with you, and it's a short one. In the beginning, this is a Sufi story. It's from the Sufi people. In the beginning, God made everything. God made the trees and the rocks, the rains and the wind, the worms and the birds. God made everything. And then the time came to make people. And so God crafted people's bodies out of clay of every color, and they were beautiful. And God blew, and the bodies came to life. And then God made the souls out of threads from clouds and robins' dreams and the hopes of snails. And the souls were beautiful, ethereal, fluttering things. Then God said to the souls, all right, go into there, pointing to the bodies. But God's timing was terrible, because in that moment, one of the bodies burped, and another one started scratching, and a third was just kind of standing, rocking back and forth and looking at the sky. So the souls said, we don't want to go into those things. Are you kidding? They're disgusting. And God shrugged, then leaned down and whispered into the bodies' ears. And the bodies began to clap out a rhythm. And as they clapped out that rhythm, they began for the first time to sing. And as they sang, they began to sway back and forth, and soon they were dancing. And they danced until they were exhausted and settled down and laughed. And they began to tell each other stories about the clapping and the music and the dance. And they were having so much fun that the souls looked at them and said, hey, what's going on? We want some of that. We're the souls. Shouldn't we have all of that? So God shrugged and kind of gestured. There you go. So the souls slid down out of the air and into the bodies. And so it has been from that day to this, that it is music, song, dance, and story that keep body and soul together. My name is Laura Packer. You're going to see in the comments an opportunity for a survey, so please fill that out because that lets the Kauffman Foundation know how we're doing, and I'm so grateful to the Kauffman Foundation for sponsoring this event and others like it. I am delighted to see you here all. Thank you so much for coming. I wish you the best. Stay healthy, stay safe, and keep telling stories. Thank you.